Clear indicator that that champion tends to be underpowered. As we count down the list, keep in mind we'll only be looking at win rates from Season 1 onwards, and that the win rates I provide may not be exact, but are estimates within 1% or so it is safe to say that they're accurate enough. As well, we'll only be looking at win rates that lasted for at least a week. Let's get started. Number 10 is Release Lucian at 38% on patch 3.10. With a fairly low damage kit and extremely high mana costs, Lucian suffered a lot on his release as a champion. A bug making his Q cost double the mana lasted for a long time as well, and prevented any of his strengths from shining through. His passive was also clunky and unintuitive, and overall we were left with a lackluster AD carry that wasn't able to make up for his flaws in any way at all really. His time in the spotlight came eventually after buffs to his passive, Q, and mana regen, as well as some bug fixes, which finally bumped up his weaknesses just enough to give his power a chance to really shine through. Number 9 is Urgot at 37.5% on patch 1.0.0.143. After receiving a massive nerf that lowered not only his damage but his range on his Q, E, and ultimate, Urgot's laning power and pick potential hit rock bottom, as what made him a strong pick was completely gutted on that patch. He would go on to be one of the consistently lowest win rate champions for about 2 years or so, and that consistency resulted in Urgot becoming the brunt of community jokes and the go-to comparison for any underpowered champion, until he was buffed significantly in Season 5 and came back as a strong solo laner and a reasonably strong AD carry. Number 8 is Kassadin at 37% on patch 5.4. After being overpowered as hell for about a year and going through a crazy number of nerf cycles, Kassadin received a nerf to the range on his ultimate that completely destroyed his entire kit. The range went down by a bit over 35% and ruined a lot of the techniques that made him a powerful champion. Most weren't too unhappy about this change, as Kassadin had been a pretty dominant force for a really long time, but it goes to show what happens when you take away what makes a champion strong. His already exploitable weaknesses became impossible to recover from, and even after a few buffs, he's still a somewhat weak champion today. Number 7 is Karma at 37% as well. She maintained this low win rate consistently across several patches before her rework, and it proved how necessary her rework was. A lot of people might remember the old Karma as a champion that wasn't necessarily that bad, and had a pretty cool kit with the mantra interaction, but she definitely failed to find an identity in a team and struggled in finding her optimal position and strengths over other champions. Her kit lacked strengths as a whole and didn't have too many tools to outplay opponents, and to top it off, her supportive kit was chock full of unhealthy design, so buffing her was pretty much out of the question until she could receive a full rework and became a much stronger champion. Number 6 is Tahm Kench at 36.5%. On release at patch 5.13, Tahm Kench as a champion had a really goofy kit that had a hard time finding a place in a team. People didn't really know where to play him, and he shuffled around the roles of jungle, top, and support quite a bit, all while failing to have the tools to beat opponents. He didn't really have anything going for him, with his passive being unreliable due to having a short duration, and most of the strengths in his kit being extremely difficult to take advantage of. And with low damage in his kit as a whole, he didn't really have anything to make up for it when he couldn't land 3 stacks of his passive. He's gotten some buffs since, and is finally starting to emerge as a top-tier top laner. Number 5 is Yasuo at 36%. Release Yasuo on patch 3.15 wasn't necessarily weak, but he was riddled with bugs and his kit was filled with clunky mechanics and counterintuitive elements. Sometimes his wind wall would even block his allies' skill shots, and his kit as a whole had a really hard time coming together the way it does now. He was super difficult to use and had weird animations and nuances in his kit, and as a result he was incredibly difficult to play, so hard that his kit as a whole was a lot weaker, and executing some of the tougher mechanics we see now was basically impossible. After some quality of life buffs and improving the functionality of his kit as a whole overall, he became one of the best champions in the game off of the back of his ridiculously overloaded kit. Number 4 is Evelynn at 34.5%. Similar to Karma, this version of Evelynn lasted for a long time, about a year in fact, around most of Season 2 after Evelynn had received one of the biggest nerfs ever. Her kit was insanely underpowered, and she had a really hard time finding an identity, and more importantly, finding strengths to take advantage of. To top it off, just like with Karma, her kit was so unhealthy that the chance of her getting any buffs up until her rework was basically zero, since she was such an unfair champion if her kit was in a state that was strong enough to be relevant. Eventually her rework was pretty strong, and she was able to rise up again in the meta for quite some time, first as a mid laner and then as a jungler. Number 3 was Azir at 34% on release on patch 4.16. Similar to Yasuo, this release wasn't a byproduct of him being a weak champion, but rather a byproduct of him being loaded with bugs and having very poor functionality within his kit. With a kit as complex and intricate as Azir's, one error from a bug or just general clunkiness in his kit can ruin an entire combo, not to mention how easy it was to just straight up walk through his ultimate half the time. In the next patch he received literally 20 bug fixes, and would go on to receive a few small buffs until becoming the best mid lane champion in the game for quite some time. Number 2 is Bard at 33.5%. Bard on release at patch 5.5 is the clear opposite of Azir and Yasuo in that he had more than enough utility in his kit, but his incredibly high cooldowns, low damages, low stats, and a weak passive led to him being a ridiculously underpowered champion. He's a case of a champion just really having insanely low numbers in their kit, and because of that, his utility wasn't able to do enough to have the impact you would want from a support champion. His goofy kit caused players to also have a very hard time playing him, and so he was super difficult to play, but after a few buffs in the hand of a skilled Bard player, he's become a powerful support champion. And number 1 is Syndra at a whopping 27%. On release in patch 1.0.0.147, Syndra culminated everything it takes for a champion to have a low win rate. She had crazy underpowered numbers, ridiculous bugs, clunky functionality, and she was super hard to play. You name it, Syndra had it all. Not only was she one of the weakest champions the game has ever seen, but her kit was clunky and super difficult to use, and her stun was bugged and was really unreliable. To put a 27% win rate in perspective, the win rate of a 4 versus 5, the win rate of having someone on your team disconnect from the start of the game all the way until the end of the game for the entire game, is 14%. Syndra wasn't even twice as likely to win a game with an AFK on it. A team playing against a Syndra would have more than a 70% chance to win just because you were playing against Syndra. I mean, to me, that win rate is insane. After a lot of buffs, and I really do mean a lot